Dylan Parker had always prided himself on doing things his own way. A freelance graphic designer with a penchant for creative living, he'd spent years cultivating not only a successful career, but also a personal sanctuary in a quiet suburban neighborhood. His home was more than a roof over his head. It was his canvas, a place where every wall told a story of independence and artistic freedom. The house, a charming mid-century modern structure with generous windows, a wraparound porch, and a backyard bursting with wildflowers and carefully repurposed vintage furniture, was his pride and joy. It was here that Dylan spent evenings sipping cold brew on the porch, sketching ideas in his notebook, and finding solace from a world that often demanded conformity. But in this neighborhood, conformity was enforced with an iron fist. Overseeing the community was an HOA infamous for its arbitrary rules and unreasonable demands. At the helm of this bureaucratic regime was Kerren, a self-appointed enforcer with an attitude as unyielding as the policy she wielded. Known for her perfectly pressed suits, clipped tone, and an ever-present clipboard, Kerren had become the embodiment of entitlement in the eyes of many residents. To her, every detail of a home's appearance was subject to her strict interpretation of community standards. Dylan first encountered Kerren on a radiant Saturday morning when he was tending to the roses in his meticulously landscaped front yard. As he trimmed a hedge with gentle precision, a sleek sedan pulled up along the curb. Out stepped Kerren, her eyes fixed in a steely gaze and her posture exuding authority. In one perfectly timed moment, she strode up his driveway, clutching a thick envelope embossed with the HOA seal. "Mr. Parker," she announced in a clipped, businesslike tone, "I'm here on behalf of the HOA to address a matter of utmost importance regarding your property." Dylan, wiping sweat from his brow and still holding his pruning shears, set them aside and regarded her with a mix of curiosity and irritation. "I'm listening," he replied, his voice calm yet edged with caution. Kerren's gaze swept over the vibrant, artful display of landscaping, the whimsical wind chimes, and the eclectic mix of decor that defined Dylan's home. "Your property is in violation of community standards," she declared. "Specifically, your choice of door hardware and the unconventional style of your entryway decorations do not align with the approved guidelines. As such, I demand that you provide me with your house keys so I can personally inspect and, if necessary, rectify these issues." Dylan blinked. Keys? Inspect his house? The very idea that a volunteer enforcer, someone who had never been elected, could demand entry into his private residence was as absurd as it was infuriating. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "but my home is my private space. I've never agreed to your HOA's rules, and I certainly won't hand over my keys to you." Kerren's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This is not a request, Mr. Parker. It's an order. Our community standards are in effect for every resident, and noncompliance will not be tolerated." Her tone left no room for negotiation. As a few curious neighbors peeked from behind their hedges, the confrontation escalated from a polite discussion to a public display of authority versus independence. Dylan folded his arms, his expression firm. "I understand you have guidelines you want enforced, but I live by my own rules. My property, my style, my choices, they're protected by local law, not your arbitrary dictates." His voice, steady and resolute, hinted at a history of standing up for his freedom, a freedom that now faced an unwanted challenge. Kerren's face flushed with indignation. "If you refuse to comply, you leave me no choice but to take further action," she snapped before turning on her heel and storming off, leaving behind an envelope filled with formal warnings and a community buzzing with whispered speculations. That afternoon, as Dylan sat in his sunlit studio surrounded by his sketches and design projects, he reread the envelope's contents. Every line of the notice reeked of overreach, fines for nonconforming aesthetics, threats of legal action, and demands that extended far beyond any reasonable interpretation of community upkeep. It was clear that Kerren's mission was not to enhance the neighborhood's beauty. It was to assert control over anyone who dared to live differently. In that quiet moment of reflection, Dylan resolved that he would not allow an entitled bully to dictate how he lived his life. His home was a sanctuary, a testament to creativity and individuality, and no set of rules could ever diminish that. The first confrontation had been a spark, and little did Kerren know, it would soon ignite a blaze of community resistance. With determination kindled in his heart, Dylan began to gather his research on local zoning laws and property rights, preparing for the battle ahead. The stage was set for a long, hard-fought struggle over the sanctity of one man's home and the very idea of personal freedom. The morning after the confrontation, Dylan awoke to a disquieting sight. As he made his way to the front door, he discovered a freshly printed notice firmly taped to it. The document, bearing the same intimidating HOA seal and Kerren's signature in bold, listed a series of violations that now included not only his entryway decor, but also an additional charge: failure to provide house keys for inspection. The tone was chillingly formal, outlining steep fines and the possibility of legal action if he did not comply immediately. Dylan's pulse quickened as he read aloud. A fine of $1,000 will be imposed for noncompliance with community standards regarding property access. He shook his head in disbelief. His home, carefully designed and cherished as an extension of his creative soul, was suddenly being subjected to demands that had no basis in any law he recognized. Shortly thereafter, there was a sharp knock on the door. Dylan opened it to find two uniformed individuals standing there with clipboards and stern expressions. They introduced themselves as compliance inspectors from the HOA, sent to conduct a full inspection of his property. Their presence was both surreal and intrusive. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," one of the inspectors said, his tone rehearsed. "We are here to verify that your property adheres to the established community standards. Please provide us with your keys so that we can inspect the interior for any deviations." Dylan's reply was calm and measured. "I'm sorry, but my property is governed by city regulations and my own rights as a homeowner. I do not recognize your authority to demand my keys or to inspect my home without proper legal process." His eyes met theirs steadily, a silent declaration that he would not be bullied into submission. The inspectors hesitated, glancing at one another as if uncertain how to proceed. Before any further words were exchanged, Kerren's voice crackled through a portable speaker from a parked vehicle outside. "Mr. Parker, do not test our patience. The rules apply to every property in this community, and noncompliance will be met with immediate consequences." Her voice, high-pitched and dripping with entitlement, echoed down the street. Inside, Dylan felt a mix of anger and resolve. He gathered the notice, made digital copies of every line, and sent an email to the local zoning office detailing the absurdity of the demands. In his message, he wrote, "I am fully compliant with all applicable local codes, and I reject the HOA's overreaching and unenforceable directives. I request that you review these documents and provide guidance on the legality of such actions." Later that day, Dylan took to his community blog. With a wry sense of humor and a firm tone, he posted a detailed account of the morning's events. He explained how a stranger in uniform had tried to force his way into his private home under the guise of community standards, and how he had refused, citing his rights as a homeowner. His post quickly resonated with many residents who had long harbored silent frustrations about the HOA's invasive practices. Comments poured in, some praising his stand for independence, others expressing concern about potential backlash. As dusk fell and the warm glow of his porch lights bathed the exterior of his home in a comforting light, Dylan organized every piece of evidence he'd collected. The printed notices, emails, and even photographs of the inspectors with their clipboards were carefully filed away. He knew this was only the beginning. Kerren's first power move had set the stage for an escalating battle between individual freedom and authoritarian rule. That night, as Dylan sat on his back porch, he couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. The HOA's tactics were not about community improvement, they were about control, and they had no place in a neighborhood that valued creativity and personal expression. With his mind already racing through plans for further research and community outreach, he vowed that he would not be intimidated. Tomorrow, he would begin gathering more concrete evidence to expose these abuses for what they were, nothing more than an overreach by an entitled few. In the days that followed, it became increasingly clear that Kerren and the HOA were not content with a single act of intimidation. Their tactics escalated from cold, bureaucratic warnings to overt displays of power designed to subdue any hint of resistance. Flyers began appearing on community bulletin boards and in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, each reiterating the HOA's standards and warning of dire consequences for any noncompliance. The messages were uniform in tone. Your property is under review. Compliance is mandatory. Late one afternoon, as Dylan pored over local zoning regulations in his study, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. A monotone voice on the other end delivered an ultimatum. Mr. Parker, you must schedule an immediate inspection of your property within the next 48 hours. Failure to do so will result in additional fines and potential legal action, including property seizure. The threat was delivered without emotion, but with an unmistakable edge of coercion. Dylan calmly informed the caller that he would only comply with an inspection if it were conducted by legally authorized personnel and under proper notice. He then recorded the call, adding another piece of evidence to his growing dossier against the HOA's overreach. Around the same time, whispers began circulating among his neighbors. Several residents confided in Dylan that they too had received mysterious notices, warnings about non-conforming property features, or threats of fines for failing to meet a nebulous standard of community harmony. One elderly homeowner tearfully mentioned that she'd been fined for having a cherished antique mailbox that didn't match the HOA's color scheme. The stories painted a picture of an organization bent on enforcing conformity by any means necessary, even if it meant trampling on individual rights. Determined to get to the bottom of the issue, Dylan installed discreet security cameras around his property. Each morning, he reviewed the footage with a critical eye, noting the exact times when unauthorized inspectors appeared, when new notices were posted, and even when Kerren herself could be seen lurking near his home. The evidence was mounting, and it wasn't long before he discovered inconsistencies in the HOA's records. A former board member, speaking off the record at a local coffee shop, hinted that Kerren was funneling money from fines into a personal community improvement fund, a fund that, in reality, was used to further her own agenda. Galvanized by these revelations, Dylan began reaching out to other affected homeowners. Small, informal meetings were held in the back rooms of local diners and community centers. There, residents shared their grievances, comparing notes on the fines they'd received and the arbitrary inspections that had disrupted their lives. What had begun as isolated incidents soon formed a pattern, a systemic abuse of power that was both widespread and deeply invasive. Dylan's blog posts became a rallying point. He published detailed articles, complete with scanned copies of notices, transcripts of phone calls, and snippets from local zoning laws that clearly contradicted the HOA's actions. His articulate, well-documented exposés resonated with many, sparking an online movement against the HOA's authoritarian practices. Comments and shares grew exponentially, and soon enough, a petition demanding accountability was circulated among the community. Every new piece of evidence added weight to Dylan's case. His dossier, meticulously organized and bolstered by personal testimonies, painted a damning portrait of an organization that prioritized conformity over the rights of individual homeowners. The momentum was building, and even some long-silent board members began to question Kerren's methods during private discussions. Their admissions, albeit whispered in caution, confirmed what many had suspected. The HOA was less interested in community welfare than in consolidating power. As tension mounted and the neighborhood began to buzz with discontent, Dylan realized that his fight was no longer just personal. It had become a battle for the soul of the entire community. Every unauthorized notice, every unexpected inspector, and every threat served as a reminder that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance. And as he looked out over his property, bathed in the golden light of another resolute afternoon, Dylan vowed that he would expose every injustice until the HOA was forced to answer for its actions. One cool morning, as the neighborhood slowly stirred awake, Dylan was greeted by a scene that underscored the extreme lengths to which the HOA was willing to go. As he stepped outside, he was met by a convoy of 2 rental vans parked at the edge of his driveway, their sides emblazoned with the HOA logo and the words Community Compliance. Out of the vans emerged a small team of uniformed enforcers carrying toolboxes, measuring tapes, and a determined glint in their eyes. Their mission was unmistakable: to forcefully correct every aspect of Dylan's property so it adhered to the HOA's draconian standards. At the center of the commotion stood Kerren, her face a mix of fury and false authority. "Mr. Parker," she shouted, striding forward, "if you continue to defy our community standards, you leave me no choice but to seize further action. I demand that you surrender your house keys immediately so we can conduct a full-scale inspection and, if necessary, enforce corrective measures." Her tone was icy and uncompromising, as if this demand were as natural as breathing. Dylan's eyes flashed with defiance. "I've already told you," he replied steadily. "My home is my private sanctuary. I will not hand over my keys to anyone, least of all to someone who bases her authority on arbitrary rules." His voice carried not only his personal conviction, but also the quiet strength of countless instances when he had stood up for his rights. A hush fell over the gathering. Neighbors, who had gathered at a safe distance to witness the confrontation, began recording the incident on their smartphones. The enforcers exchanged uncertain glances as Kerren's demand hung in the air, a demand that went far beyond any legitimate inspection procedure. One of them hesitated and mumbled, "Sir, are you aware that this is a directive from the HOA?" Only Kerren could answer that, and her response was swift and laced with indignation. "Do not question my authority." Dylan, undeterred, calmly produced a printed copy of the local zoning code and property rights legislation. "According to Section 12.3 of our municipal code, I have every right to privacy on my property. Your demands are not enforceable by law," he stated, holding the documents aloft as undeniable evidence of his rights. His measured words resonated through the quiet morning, challenging the very foundation of the HOA's overreach. As tensions escalated, several neighbors began to voice their support. "This is our home, not yours," one resident shouted. Another added, "Kerren, you have no business coming onto someone else's property." The public outcry was a turning point. The very act of demanding keys, an absurd intrusion into personal liberty, had sparked a wave of communal defiance. With the neighborhood rallying behind him, Dylan saw an opportunity to expose the corruption at the heart of the HOA. Later that day, he organized an impromptu community meeting in the local town hall. There he presented his dossier, a comprehensive collection of evidence documenting every overreach, from baseless fines and unwarranted inspections to Kerren's invasive demands for keys. His presentation was clear, methodical, and backed by legal citations, leaving little room for rebuttal. "Today," Dylan declared to the packed room, "we stand together to assert our rights. No one's property should be subject to arbitrary and invasive control. The HOA's rules are not above the law, and our collective voice is stronger than any dictatorial decree." The room erupted in applause as neighbors recounted their own harrowing experiences with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Kerren, witnessing the swelling unity and public opposition, tried to maintain her composure. But as the evidence mounted and the community's defiant spirit grew, even her most staunch supporters began to waver. It was clear that her tactics were not only failing to intimidate, they were galvanizing a movement. That evening, as Dylan walked home under a sky painted with the hues of dusk, he felt a surge of determination. His stand against Kerren's outrageous demands had not only protected his home, but had ignited a spark of rebellion throughout the neighborhood. The battle was far from over, but the message was clear. When people unite to defend their freedoms, no amount of arbitrary power can silence their voice. As the community's resistance grew stronger and Kerren's authority began to crumble, her tactics grew increasingly desperate. One early morning, before the first light had fully broken through the horizon, Kerren made a final, audacious bid to reclaim control. In a move that would shock the neighborhood, she appeared at Dylan's front door unannounced. But this time, her demand was even more invasive. "I demand that you hand over your house keys right now, so that we may secure your property for a mandatory inspection." Her voice, trembling with fury, brooked no discussion. Dylan, already braced by the events of previous days, stood his ground. "I'm sorry, Kerren, but I will not hand over my keys. My property is private, and I do not consent to any unauthorized entry." His tone was calm yet unyielding, a stark contrast to her frantic urgency. Enraged by his defiance, Kerren's eyes blazed. "You leave me no choice," she screamed. In a moment of sheer desperation, she pulled out her cell phone and, without a moment's hesitation, dialed 911. "This is an emergency," she shouted into the phone, claiming that Dylan's refusal and his alleged noncompliance were a direct threat to community safety. "I demand that officers come immediately. This is a public disturbance." Within minutes, the sound of sirens shattered the early morning calm. Uniformed police cars pulled up to the curb, and officers approached the scene with cautious authority. Dylan, standing resolutely on his front porch, calmly greeted them. "Good morning, officers," he said. "I understand there's been a complaint, but I assure you, there's no disturbance here, only a disagreement over my property rights." The officers listened as Kerren, red-faced and sputtering, attempted to justify her call. "He refused to give me his house keys," she insisted, her voice quavering between indignation and panic. "I'm trying to enforce the rules. He's putting the entire community at risk." One of the officers, after a brief but thorough review of the situation, interjected in a measured tone, "Ma'am, without a proper warrant or legal basis, we cannot compel you to take possession of someone's keys. This is a private matter." Their calm authority, coupled with Dylan's well-documented evidence, began to expose the absurdity of Kerren's claims. As the officers took statements and reviewed the evidence on hand, including copies of the previous notices and Dylan's legal research, it became increasingly clear that Kerren's desperate move was nothing more than an abuse of power. The situation, now being recorded by several neighbors on their smartphones, quickly spread on social media, and the viral footage showed a once confident enforcer reduced to a state of humiliation. In the midst of the chaos, one of Kerren's hired investigators was caught on one of Dylan's security cameras sneaking around the side of the house. The video, later played at the next HOA meeting, provided undeniable proof of her illegal tactics. The evidence painted a damning picture. Kerren was not only demanding house keys without any legal authority, but she was also willing to break the law by using unauthorized personnel to spy on residents. At the emergency HOA meeting that followed later that day, Dylan wasted no time in presenting the video footage and all the documentation he had amassed. The room fell silent as the evidence unfolded. Kerren's call to 911, her frantic demands, and the incriminating footage of the investigator. "This is the culmination of a pattern of abuse," Dylan declared. "We will not allow arbitrary power to infringe on our rights. No one's property is for you to control." As murmurs of shock and indignation rippled through the crowd, it became unmistakably clear. Kerren's final, desperate move had sealed her fate. The community's support for Dylan, and for every resident who had suffered under the HOA's overreach, was now at its peak. The evidence was irrefutable, and Kerren's days as the tyrannical enforcer were numbered. When the officers finally departed, leaving behind a scene of stunned silence and simmering outrage, Dylan took a deep breath. His steadfast refusal had not only protected his property, but it also exposed the depth of the HOA's corruption. Kerren's call to 911, intended as a final power play, had instead become the catalyst for a full-scale uprising against her authoritarian rule. In the aftermath of Kerren's final desperate move, the community's response was swift and uncompromising. What began as isolated incidents of overreach had transformed into a full-blown revolt against an HOA that had long operated in secrecy and intimidation. At an emergency town meeting held in the local community center, residents from every corner of the neighborhood gathered, united by a shared resolve to reclaim their rights. Dylan, with his dossier of evidence in hand, was invited to speak before the packed room. His presentation was methodical and impassioned as he recounted the string of abuses, from baseless fines and unauthorized inspections to Kerren's outrageous demand for house keys and her ill-conceived call to 911. "This is not just about one home," he declared. It's about the fundamental right of every resident to live free of arbitrary interference. We must hold those in power accountable. One by one, residents took to the stage to share their own experiences of intimidation. An elderly woman recounted how she'd been harassed for her non-traditional garden ornaments, while a local business owner detailed how his storefront had been targeted by unexplained fines. The stories painted a damning portrait of an HOA that cared more about conformity than the well-being of its community. Amid the rising tide of public outcry, several disillusioned board members, once complicit in Kerren's authoritarian methods, stepped forward to denounce her actions. In a historic, unanimous vote later that evening, the board resolved to remove Kerren from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with cheers and a palpable sense of relief from a community that had long suffered under her reign. In the days that followed, local authorities, spurred by media coverage and the overwhelming evidence presented by Dylan and other residents, launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. Financial records, internal emails, and the mountain of documented abuses revealed a pattern of corruption and extortion that shocked even the most skeptical citizens. Headlines soon dominated local news. HOA scandal. Kerren's tyranny exposed. Community reclaims its rights. For Dylan, watching the collapse of the old HOA regime was bittersweet. His home, which had once been the battleground for Kerren's invasive demands, now stood as a proud symbol of individual freedom and community resilience. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines and secret inspections now gathered freely at block parties and community meetings, united in their commitment to a new era of transparency and accountability. The newly elected HOA board, composed of residents who had been on the front lines of the struggle, immediately set about drafting a new charter. Their vision was simple yet profound, a governing body that respected the rights of every homeowner, that operated with full transparency, and that could be held accountable by the very people it served. The old regime of fear, with its secret fines and unauthorized inspections, was dismantled piece by piece, replaced by policies that celebrated individuality and community cooperation. As the oppressive shadow of Kerren's rule receded, the neighborhood began to heal. The air was filled with cautious optimism and the promise of a brighter, freer future. Dylan often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, a journey marked by courage, unity, and the unwavering belief that no one should ever have to surrender their keys or their freedom to an overreaching bully. One cool evening, as he sat on his front porch watching the sunset, Dylan smiled softly. The battle had been long and hard, but justice had finally prevailed. The community's victory was a testament to the power of unity and the courage to stand up for one's rights. Following the dramatic upheaval in the community, local authorities moved swiftly to ensure that the abuses of the old HOA would never be repeated. In a series of high-profile court hearings, the full extent of the corruption was laid bare. Dylan's meticulously compiled dossier, complete with video footage, emails, and sworn testimonies, served as a cornerstone of the case against the HOA. City officials imposed substantial fines on the association for unlawfully enforcing regulations on properties not under its jurisdiction. In addition, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of every affected homeowner. During the proceedings, judges and magistrates condemned the arbitrary tactics and blatant overreach of the old board, stating unequivocally that no individual's property rights could be compromised by unauthorized rules and secret fines. Media outlets provided round-the-clock coverage, and headlines splashed with phrases like tyranny overturned and community triumphs over bullying. As punitive measures were levied and settlements reached, several former board members faced criminal charges ranging from fraud to embezzlement. The legal fallout was swift and decisive, a powerful message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. The newly reformed HOA, now run by residents dedicated to transparency and fairness, pledged to rebuild the organization on a foundation of democratic principles. Their first act was to dissolve the archaic policies that had enabled Kerren's reign, replacing them with rules that honored the rights and privacy of every homeowner. For Dylan and his neighbors, the legal victory was not only a personal triumph, It was a vindication of their collective struggle. His final power move, exposing the truth through undeniable evidence, had forced the authorities to act. And, in doing so, it ensured that future generations would be safeguarded against similar abuses of power. While the HOA faced its legal reckoning, Kerren's personal life unraveled at an alarming pace. Once the infallible enforcer of community standards, she was now the subject of damning headlines and scathing online commentary. Articles detailed her erratic behavior, her unauthorized demands, and her desperate tactics, including the infamous incident where she demanded Dylan's house keys and then called 911 when he refused. Former allies and board members distanced themselves from her, and whispers of financial mismanagement spread through the neighborhood. It soon emerged that much of her lavish lifestyle had been funded by misappropriated HOA fines, a revelation that left her reputation in tatters. The once feared enforcer was now a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked power goes awry. In a final twist of fate, Kerren attempted to secure a new job in property management, hoping to rebuild her career on a different foundation. But when she arrived for her first day at a reputable firm known for its ethical standards, she was met with incredulous stares and thinly veiled ridicule. A coworker unable to resist a jab whispered, "I hope you like following orders now, because that's all you'll be doing." The remark, laced with bitter irony, underscored the extent of her fall from grace. For Dylan and the rest of the community, Kerren's personal downfall was the ultimate vindication. Her arrogance and overreach had been exposed for all to see, and the very tactics she had once wielded to control others had become the instruments of her undoing. Her image, once synonymous with ruthless enforcement, was now reduced to a faded memory, a stark reminder that no one is above the law. Months after the tumultuous series of events, the neighborhood had transformed into a community united by resilience and freedom. Dylan Parker's home, once the battleground for an outrageous power play, now stood as a proud symbol of individual rights and communal solidarity. Neighbors strolled the streets with renewed confidence, sharing laughter and stories of past injustices that now seemed like distant memories. On a crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the neighborhood in a warm, golden glow, Dylan sat on his front porch, savoring a moment of well-earned peace. A longtime friend, still brimming with good humor and defiant spirit, approached with a handmade HOA violation notice, printed on brightly colored paper. The notice read, "Violation, excessive freedom. Penalty, eternal joy." Dylan chuckled and shook his head. "They really tried," he murmured, echoing the rallying cry that had once galvanized the community. The playful gesture wasn't just a joke. It was a celebration of victory over arbitrary control and a reminder that true power lies in the courage to stand up for one's rights. As twilight deepened and stars began to twinkle overhead, the sound of friendly chatter and laughter filled the air. The oppressive shadow of Kerren's reign had long since lifted, replaced by a community determined to safeguard its freedom. Dylan leaned back in his chair, content in the knowledge that the battle had been fought and won not by the force of a bully, but by the unity and resilience of a people who refused to be intimidated. Fade to black.